There is a war happening above your head right now, and you don't even know it. Bombs are falling, real ones, real fire, real screaming, real children being torn away from their parents and packed onto trains with name tags pinned to their coats like luggage, sent off into the countryside to live with strangers because their own city has become too dangerous to keep them in. This isn't fantasy. This isn't the magical part of the story yet. This is just London in the middle of the night during the Blitz, and it is the kind of horror that doesn't need a witch or a wardrobe to make your chest tighten. And it's into that exact horror, that exact fracture in the world, that four ordinary children are about to be thrown, stripped from their mother, stripped from their home, sent away to live in a strange cavernous old house with a stranger they've never met, in a part of the country they don't recognize, surrounded by silence so total it feels almost louder than the bombs they left behind. And in that house, in an upstairs room, nobody bothers to check. There's a wardrobe, just a wardrobe. Old wood, slightly too large for the room it's sitting in. The kind of furniture that feels like it's been waiting for centuries for someone foolish enough or brave enough or simply curious enough to open its doors and step inside. What waits on the other side of that wardrobe is not just snow. It is not just talking animals and frozen rivers and a fawn with the legs of a goat who looks far too nervous for someone who's about to invite a child in for tea. What waits on the other side is 100 years of suffering, a curse so total that an entire kingdom has forgotten what spring even feels like. A queen who has convinced an entire world that winter is simply the way things are now, the way things will always be, and that hope itself is a foolish, childish thing to still believe in. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, one of these four children is going to make a choice that nearly destroys everything. A choice driven by jealousy, by resentment, by the quiet, corrosive ache of feeling like the least important person in your own family. And that choice is going to put the people he loves most in mortal danger, and it's going to demand a sacrifice so enormous, so final that even the children watching this story unfold for the first time will feel the air leave the room when it happens. This is the story of four siblings, a wardrobe, a witch, and a lion. This is the Chronicles of Narnia. The lion, the witch, and the wardrobe. And by the time we're finished tonight, I think you're going to understand why this film, released at the tail end of 2005, didn't just succeed as a piece of family entertainment. I think you're going to understand why underneath the snow and the swords and the talking beavers, it managed to smuggle in one of the most quietly devastating ideas about guilt, grace, and forgiveness that mainstream Hollywood cinema had attempted in years. Let's set the stage properly first because context matters here more than it usually does. C.S. Lewis published the original novel back in 1950, the first book to hit shelves in what would eventually become a 7 book series, even though chronologically inside the story's own timeline, it's actually the second tale to take place. Lewis wrote it not as some grand calculated literary architecture, but almost as an act of personal recovery, drawing on his own childhood, on his deep, lifelong Christian faith, on the trauma of having lived through 2 world wars himself, and on a simple recurring image that had haunted his imagination for years: a fawn carrying an umbrella and parcels, walking through a snowy wood. For decades, the book sat there as a beloved staple of children's literature, adapted occasionally into television specials and animated versions, but never quite given the cinematic scale that its mythology seemed to be begging for. Then, in the early 2000s, something shifted in the industry. The success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy had proven decisively that audiences were hungry for sprawling, that immersive fantasy worlds taken seriously, shot with genuine craftsmanship, populated by practical creature work and real locations rather than cheap dated effects. And the success of the first Harry Potter film had proven something else entirely, that a British school age, slightly melancholy brand of magic could fill theatres across the entire world, not just in the UK. Walden Media acquired the rights to Lewis's series back in 2001 and eventually partnered with Walt Disney Pictures to actually finance and produce the adaptation at the scale it deserved. Several big names circled the director's chair over the following years, but the job ultimately landed with Andrew Adamson, a filmmaker best known up to that point for co-directing the first 2 Shrek films. On paper, that might seem like an odd choice for a story this sincere, this earnest, this spiritually weighted, but Adamson brought something valuable to the table: a genuine hands on understanding of how to balance wonder and humor, how to make audiences believe in a world built from equal parts whimsy and danger without ever tipping fully into parody. The cast itself was largely unknown at the time of casting, which in retrospect turned out to be one of the smartest decisions the production made. Georgie Henley, just a child herself during filming, was cast as Lucy, the youngest of the four Pevensie siblings. Skandar Keynes took on the role of Edmund, the troubled middle brother whose arc would end up carrying the emotional spine of the entire film. Anna Popplewell played Susan, the practical, skeptical older sister, and William Moseley played Peter, the eldest, suddenly thrust into a position of responsibility he never asked for and isn't sure he's ready to carry. Around these four young, largely untested actors, the production assembled a supporting cast with real heft. Tilda Swinton, already a respected and distinctive screen presence, took on the role of Jadis, the White Witch, delivering a performance that would go on to define the character for an entire generation of viewers. James McAvoy, in one of his earlier prominent film roles, played Mr. Tumnus, the nervous, conflicted faun who becomes the very first Narnian the children encounter. And in a stroke of voice casting that elevated the entire production, Liam Neeson lent his voice to Aslan, the great lion at the heart of Narnia's mythology. A character whose gravity, whose quiet, immovable authority depended entirely on finding a voice capable of carrying both tenderness and terrifying power in the same breath. The film premiered in early December of 2005, timed deliberately for the holiday season, banking on exactly the kind of family audience goodwill that had carried Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings to such massive success in years prior, and the gamble paid off. Made on a budget of roughly $180 million, the film went on to gross north of $745 million worldwide, making it one of the biggest box office success stories of that entire year. Critics were largely warm toward it as well, praising its sincerity, its visual craftsmanship, and in particular the performances of its young, largely unknown cast. At the Academy Awards, the film took home the Oscar for Best Makeup and earned additional nominations for its sound mixing and visual effects, a quiet but real acknowledgement of just how much tactile, hands-on craftsmanship had gone into building this world from the ground up, rather than leaning entirely on the kind of detailed shortcuts that other fantasy films of the era were increasingly relying on. But none of those numbers, none of those accolades really explain why this film still gets brought up, still gets rewatched every winter by families looking for something that feels both comforting and quietly profound. To understand that, we actually have to step inside the story itself, scene by scene, and feel the way it builds. We open not in Narnia at all, but in the middle of a German bombing raid over London during the Second World War. The film wastes no time establishing real, grounded stakes before it ever asks the audience to believe in magic. Sirens wail, searchlights cut through smoke filled skies. And in the middle of all that chaos, we meet the four Pevensey children scrambling through the dark toward a bomb shelter, clutching each other, clutching what little they can carry, while the world around them seems determined to come apart at the seams. This opening matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we move forward because it tells you immediately what kind of story this is actually going to be. This isn't a fantasy adventure that happens to have child protagonists. This is a story about children who have already, before the plot even properly begins, experienced real trauma, real fear, real displacement. They've already lived through something no child should have to live through. And that context recolors everything that follows. When these kids eventually step into Narnia, they're not simply wide eyed innocents discovering wonder for the first time. They're frightened, displaced children who have already learned the hard way that the world can turn dangerous and unfamiliar without warning. Narnia, in a strange way, is simply the next strange, unfamiliar place they're forced to navigate, just with talking beavers instead of air raid sirens. The children are sent away from London for their own safety, Seldy, evacuated to the countryside, the way so many real British children were during the actual Blitz, and they arrive at the sprawling, echoing country estate of an elderly, eccentric professor, a kind, somewhat absent minded man who seems almost as mysterious as the house itself. The estate is enormous, drafty, filled with endless hallways and locked doors and furniture draped in dust sheets, the kind of setting that practically begs a curious child to go exploring, and it rains constantly. The film leans into this almost as a deliberate emotional texture for children already grieving the loss of their normal lives, already missing their mother, now trapped indoors in an unfamiliar house with nothing to do and nowhere to go. The grey monotony of the weather mirroring the grey monotony of their displaced suspended lives. It's during one of these long, boring, restless afternoons that Lucy, the youngest, wanders off on her own and discovers the wardrobe. Let's slow down here because this is the moment the entire story pivots on, and it deserves real attention rather than a passing mention. Lucy isn't looking for magic. She's looking for somewhere to hide during a game, ducking into an old wardrobe in an empty room simply because it's there, simply because it's the kind of half bored, half curious thing children do when they are trying to fill an empty afternoon. She pushes past the coats hanging inside, expecting to find the back wall of the wardrobe, and instead she keeps walking and walking until the coats give way to pine branches and the pine branches give way to falling snow, and the small cramped wardrobe she stepped into has somehow opened up into an entire forest. The way this sequence is shot matters enormously to its emotional impact. There's no dramatic musical swell announcing that something magical is happening. There's no flash of light, no special effects fanfare. It's quiet, it's gradual. It mirrors almost exactly the way wonder actually arrives in real life, not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow, dawning realization that the world has just become bigger than you previously understood it to be. And in that snowy wood, Lucy meets Mr. Tumnus. James McAvoy's performance here deserves real credit because Tumnus could easily have been played as simple comic relief, a nervous, fussy little fawn there purely to provide whimsy before the plot moves on. Instead, McAvoy brings a genuine, aching vulnerability to the role. Tumnus is nervous, yes, but underneath that nervousness, there's real conflict happening. He invites Lucy back to his cozy little home for tea, plays her gentle, melancholy music on a flute, and the entire sequence feels warm, safe, almost like a fairy tale within a fairy tale. But then the truth comes out. Tumnus has been ordered by the White Witch to report any human children he finds to her secret police, the wolves who serve as her enforcers throughout Narnia. He's been planning this entire time to hand Lucy over. And as the warmth of the tea and the music gives way to this confession, you watch Tumnus break down entirely, overwhelmed by guilt, by fear, by the impossible position he's been placed in. This is structurally an enormously important scene for the entire film because it establishes the moral terrain of Narnia before we've even properly arrived there. This isn't simply a kingdom where evil wears an obvious snarling face. The White Witch's power operates through fear, through coercion, through forcing decent, gentle creatures like Tumnus into complicity against their own conscience. That's a far more sophisticated, far more unsettling depiction of tyranny than most family films bother attempting, and it sets up the moral stakes that will eventually consume Edmund's entire arc later in the story. Tumnus, in the end, can't bring himself to betray Lucy. He helps her escape back to the wardrobe instead, choosing decency over self preservation, a choice that we later learn comes at a devastating personal cost to him. When Lucy stumbles back out of the wardrobe and into the ordinary bedroom she left only moments before, she discovers something disorienting. Barely any time has passed at all in the real world, even though she feels like she's been gone for hours. She races to tell her siblings what she's discovered, breathless with excitement, certain they'll share in her wonder, and they don't believe her. This is such a small human beat, and it's worth lingering on because it's exactly the kind of dynamic that defines sibling relationships in the real world. Peter and Susan, the two oldest, dismiss her claims gently at first. Then, with growing exasperation as she keeps insisting. Edmund, in particular, mocks her outright, teasing her relentlessly for what he assumes is simply an overactive imagination. There's something quietly painful in watching Lucy's genuine wonder get dismissed by the people closest to her, and the film doesn't rush past that emotional sting. It lets it breathe, lets us feel exactly how isolating it is to experience something extraordinary and have no one believe you. Eventually, of course, Edmund follows Lucy back into the wardrobe out of pure curiosity, mostly to prove her wrong, and discovers that Narnia is in fact entirely real. But Edmund's introduction to Narnia unfolds very differently than Lucy's did, and this divergence is the entire key to understanding his character. Where Lucy found warmth, tea, and a gentle, frightened friend in Tumnus, Edmund instead encounters the White Witch herself, gliding through the snow on her sled, radiating a cold, regal, magnetic authority that immediately ensnares him.
Tilda Swinton's performance in this introductory scene is doing an enormous amount of quiet, careful work. She doesn't play Jadis as cartoonishly evil. She plays her as seductive, patient, endlessly charming in a way that feels almost maternal at first, deliberately disarming. She offers Edmund warm drinks that materialize from nothing, enchanted Turkish delight that he can't seem to stop eating no matter how much he consumes, and most dangerously of all, she offers him attention. Genuine, focused, flattering attention, the kind of attention Edmund, as we'll soon understand, has been quietly starving for back in his real life. This is the moment the film's true emotional engine reveals itself, and it's worth pulling apart carefully, because everything that follows depends on understanding exactly what's happening inside Edmund psychologically. Edmund is the middle son, sandwiched between Peter, who as the eldest carries an inherent authority and responsibility that everyone, including Edmund, instinctively defers to, and Lucy, the youngest, whose innocence and warmth seem to draw affection effortlessly from everyone around her. Edmund occupies the uncomfortable, often overlooked middle ground. He's not the leader. He's not the baby of the family. He's just there, perpetually a half step behind, perpetually compared, even if only in his own head, to siblings who seem to have a clearer, more secure place in the family's emotional hierarchy. And in the real world, before any of this magic ever began, the film has already shown us small, telling glimpses of this dynamic. Edmund snaps at Peter during the bombing raid. He resists Peter's attempts to take charge once they arrive at the professor's house. There's a coiled resentment in him from the very beginning, a frustration that has nowhere productive to go, because how exactly do you tell your older brother, in the middle of a war, in the middle of losing your home, that what's actually bothering you is that you don't feel important enough within your own family? So when the White Witch turns her full, undivided attention onto Edmund, calling him a prince, promising him power, promising him a place of significance that has nothing to do with being someone's younger brother, she isn't simply tempting him with magic candy and a sled ride. She's offering him the exact thing his entire psychology has been quietly aching for, the feeling of mattering, of being chosen, of being seen as special rather than simply tolerated. That's why his betrayal later in the film lands with so much weight, even though he's just a child making a child's mistake. The film has done the careful, patient work of showing us exactly why someone would be vulnerable to this exact temptation, rather than simply telling us Edmund is the bratty sibling and leaving it at that. When Edmund returns from Narnia and finally admits, grudgingly, that Lucy was telling the truth, he still, in a moment of petty cruelty that the film doesn't shy away from, denies it to Peter and Susan, letting Lucy take the blame for lying when he knows full well she wasn't. It's a small, ugly moment, and it's meant to sting, because it's exactly the kind of casual cruelty siblings are capable of when their own insecurities are driving the wheel. Eventually, all four children end up tumbling into the wardrobe together, fleeing the housekeeper after one of their games goes wrong, and Narnia, for the first time, opens itself up to all of them simultaneously. What follows is the introduction of Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, two warm, talkative, deeply practical creatures who take the children in, feed them, and finally lay out the full scope of what they've stumbled into. Narnia, they explain, has been trapped under the White Witch's curse for 100 years, an endless winter with no Christmas, no spring, no end in sight. And more than that, there's a prophecy, an old, deeply embedded piece of Narnian lore suggesting that when two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve arrive in Narnia together, the witch's reign will finally come to an end. This is also where the children, and the audience, first hear the name that will dominate the rest of the film, Aslan. The beavers speak his name with a reverence that borders on religious awe, and the film stages this moment beautifully. There's a famous, quietly devastating line of dialogue here, the children asking if Aslan is safe, and being told, simply, that he isn't safe at all, but that he is good. That distinction, the idea that goodness and safety aren't the same thing, that something can be genuinely good while still being formidable, even frightening, is one of the most quietly sophisticated ideas this film hands to its young audience without ever stopping to explain itself too heavily. It's during this exact scene, while the beavers are explaining all of this, that the children, and we, realize Edmund has slipped away. He's gone to find the White Witch. He's gone to claim the reward she promised him, the power, the status, the throne he's been told will be his if he simply brings his siblings to her castle. And in this moment, the film lets us sit in real, uncomfortable dread, because we understand exactly what Edmund doesn't yet seem to fully grasp, that this isn't a reward waiting for him. It's a trap closing around all of them. Edmund's journey to the witch's castle is shot with a deliberate sense of mounting unease. The landscape grows colder, harsher, more skeletal as he travels deeper into her territory. He passes a courtyard filled with statues, stone figures frozen mid-emotion, and it's only as he gets closer that the horrifying truth becomes clear: these aren't statues at all. They're creatures, real, living creatures, turned to stone by the witch's power, presumably for daring to oppose her or simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's one of the film's most genuinely unsettling images, precisely because it's presented so quietly, so matter-of-factly, a silent courtyard full of frozen victims that the film trusts its young audience to understand the horror of without spelling it out in dialogue. When Edmund finally reaches the witch and proudly reports that his siblings are with the beavers, planning to meet Aslan, her warmth evaporates instantly. The maternal charm she displayed during their first meeting curdles into something cold and furious. She has no more use for pleasantries now that she has the information she wanted. Edmund, in this moment, finally understands, with the sinking clarity of a child realizing he's been manipulated, that he's made an enormous, possibly irreversible mistake. Back with the beavers, the remaining 3 children, now fully aware of Edmund's betrayal, have to make an immediate, painful decision: continue on to find Aslan, the only force in Narnia capable of standing against the witch, or attempt to rescue their brother first. It's Peter, stepping into the leadership role that's been gradually building throughout the film, who makes the call. They press on toward Aslan, carrying both the weight of their mission and the gnawing guilt of having, in some sense, left Edmund behind. The first sight of Aslan's camp is one of the film's most purely beautiful sequences, and it's worth letting it breathe here the way the film itself does. After all that snow, all that gray, oppressive winter, the children crest a hill and see, spread out below them, an enormous encampment of tents and banners, centaurs and griffins and all manner of mythical creatures gathered together, and beyond them, the sea, glittering under an actual, honest-to-goodness sun. It's the first warmth, literal and emotional, the film has allowed itself since the opening bombing raid, and the relief of it washes over the audience almost as powerfully as it washes over the children themselves. And then they meet Aslan. The way this film handles Aslan's introduction deserves enormous credit, because getting this character right was always going to be the single hardest creative challenge of the entire production. Aslan needed to feel genuinely massive, genuinely powerful, capable of inspiring the kind of awe and reverence the beavers had described, while also feeling warm, approachable, capable of real tenderness toward frightened children. Combining cutting-edge visual effects with Liam Neeson's voice work, the film manages to thread that needle remarkably well. When Aslan finally steps forward, golden and enormous against the white tents, there's a stillness in the scene, a held breath, that sells the character's weight far more effectively than any amount of dialogue could have. Peter, Susan, and Lucy are brought before him, and it's here that the prophecy, the responsibility, the full scope of what's being asked of these ordinary, displaced wartime children finally crystallizes. They aren't just visitors anymore. They're meant to be part of Narnia's liberation, woven into its mythology, whether they feel ready for that role or not. Susan, in particular, gets some of her most interesting material in this stretch of the film, voicing the very reasonable, very human objection that they're just children, that they don't belong in the middle of a war, that surely there's been some kind of mistake. It's worth noting how the film treats this skepticism. It doesn't punish Susan for it or frame her as a coward for asking the obvious question. It simply lets the weight of the moment answer her, the same way real responsibility often arrives in life, not because you feel ready for it, but because it's been placed in front of you regardless of readiness. Meanwhile, back at the witch's castle, Edmund is discovering exactly what kind of bargain he's actually made. This stretch of the film doesn't flinch from depicting real cruelty, restrained, certainly, for a family audience, but unmistakably present. Edmund is imprisoned. He's denied food and warmth. He watches the witch's brutal treatment of other prisoners, including, in a moment of devastating recognition, Mr. Tumnus himself, who we learn was captured and turned to stone as punishment for helping Lucy escape earlier in the story. The promised crown, the promised power, the promised significance Edmund was so desperate for, has evaporated entirely, replaced by the freezing, humiliating reality of being just another disposable pawn in the witch's larger scheme. There's something quietly important happening in this section of the film, even though it's largely told through Edmund's suffering rather than his dialogue. This is the consequence finally catching up to the choice. The film doesn't rush Edmund's punishment or soften it into something painless. It lets him sit in the full, miserable weight of what he's done, because that discomfort is exactly what's going to make his eventual redemption mean something later. Aslan, learning of Edmund's capture, dispatches a rescue party, and in a sequence that blends real tension with the film's growing willingness to depict genuine danger, Edmund is successfully freed from the witch's camp. When he's finally reunited with his siblings, the reunion isn't triumphant or joyful in any uncomplicated way. It's quiet, almost subdued, weighted down by everything that's happened. Aslan pulls Edmund aside for a private conversation that the film deliberately keeps from us, the audience. We don't hear what's said. We only see Edmund afterward, visibly changed, carrying himself differently, the swagger and resentment that defined him earlier in the film replaced by something humbler, more grounded. This choice, withholding that conversation from the audience, is one of the film's smartest and most restrained decisions. It would have been easy, even expected, to give Edmund a big, cathartic apology speech, fully spelling out his remorse and his lessons learned. Instead, the film trusts its audience to understand the transformation through behavior rather than exposition, which makes Edmund's eventual heroism in the film's climax land with far more earned weight than it otherwise might have. But forgiveness, in this story, is never going to be free. And that's where the film's most pivotal sequence arrives. The White Witch, furious at having Edmund taken from her, invokes an ancient law of Narnia known as the Deep Magic, a law stating that any traitor's life belongs to her, that for every act of treachery, blood must be spilled in payment. She arrives at Aslan's camp under a flag of parley, demanding Edmund's life as the price owed to her by ancient, unbreakable cosmic law. This is the moment the film fully commits to the spiritual and moral weight it's been quietly building toward for its entire runtime, and it's worth sitting with the implications carefully, because they're genuinely heavier than most family films are willing to attempt. The witch isn't simply being cruel for cruelty's sake here. She's invoking a law that exists above her, above Aslan, above everyone, a fundamental rule of the universe that even the most powerful, benevolent force in Narnia cannot simply ignore or override. Aslan agrees to discuss the matter with her privately. And when he returns, he informs the witch, to her visible, startled satisfaction, that he has found a way to satisfy the deep magic without taking Edmund's life. He doesn't tell the children, or the audience, exactly what that arrangement entails. Not yet. That night, in a sequence shot with hushed, mournful restraint, Susan and Lucy notice Aslan slipping away from the camp alone, and follow him into the dark. What they witness is one of the most quietly harrowing sequences in modern family filmmaking. Aslan, walking voluntarily toward the stone table, a massive ancient altar deep in the woods, where the witch and her entire horde of monstrous followers are waiting for him. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't resist. He allows himself to be bound, muzzled, jeered at and humiliated by creatures who, only days earlier, would never have dared approach him. The film stages this with a deliberate, almost unbearable patience, letting the indignity of it land fully rather than rushing past it. Susan and Lucy watch, hidden, helpless, weeping, as the single most powerful, most revered figure in this entire world allows himself to be degraded without ever raising a claw in his own defense. And then, atop the stone table itself, in front of the girls, in front of his own gathered followers, the White Witch kills him. The film doesn't soften this moment for its young audience, and it shouldn't, because softening it would have robbed the eventual resurrection of all its weight. There's real grief here, real horror, shot with a stillness and a silence that lets the enormity of the loss actually register. Lucy and Susan are left alone in the dark, beside the body of the creature who was supposed to save everyone, and for a long, agonizing stretch of screen time, the film allows you to genuinely believe, even if you already vaguely know the story, that hope itself might actually be dead. The mice that gnaw through Aslan's binding ropes, the small, tender image of Susan and Lucy laying their heads against his still form, mourning him through the night, these details matter, because they're what transformed this from a plot beat into something that actually feels like loss. The film earns its eventual resurrection precisely because it refuses to rush past the death that makes it necessary. And then, as dawn breaks, the stone table cracks in two, and Aslan is alive again. The explanation he offers afterward is elegant in its simplicity, and it's worth repeating carefully because it's the philosophical and spiritual key the entire story has been building toward. He explains that the witch knew the deep magic, the law governing traitors and their due punishment, but that there exists an older, deeper magic still, one she either never knew or had simply forgotten, a magic stating that when a willing victim, innocent of any crime themselves, is killed in a traitor's place, death itself begins to work backward. You don't need to know anything about the religious and theological underpinnings of Lewis's original novel to feel the emotional logic of that idea land. Sacrifice, freely given, in place of someone who didn't deserve mercy but received it anyway, breaking a law that seemed unbreakable. It's a profound, quietly devastating idea to hand to a young audience, and the film trusts that audience enough not to dumb it down or explain it away. What follows is the film's transition from grief into momentum. Aslan, restored, gathers his forces and rides to free the creatures the witch had turned to stone throughout her reign, including, in a moment of pure, earned joy after so much sorrow, Mr. Tumnus himself, brought back from frozen stone into warm, breathing life. And then comes the battle. The final confrontation between Aslan's forces and the witch's army is staged as a sprawling, chaotic, genuinely tense set piece, centaurs and griffins and talking animals clashing against wolves and minotaurs and monstrous, ice-cold soldiers, all while Peter, thrust fully into the role of commander that's been building throughout the entire film, leads the charge despite his own visible fear. There's a moment worth highlighting here, because it closes the loop on Edmund's entire arc in a single, decisive action. During the height of the battle, Edmund, the same boy who betrayed his siblings out of jealousy and insecurity at the start of the story, makes the calculated, courageous decision to destroy the witch's wand, the very source of her stone, transforming power, even as it costs him a serious injury in the process. It's a quiet but unmistakable piece of narrative symmetry. The boy who once sought power for himself, who craved significance and status, finally finds genuine significance not by claiming power, but by sacrificing his own safety to strip power away from someone far more dangerous than he ever was. Aslan himself ultimately confronts and kills the White Witch directly, ending her century-long reign and, with it, the endless winter that's defined Narnia for as long as anyone there can remember. The aftermath is staged with real warmth and earned catharsis. The four Pevensey children are crowned as kings and queens of Narnia, ruling together for what we're told is years, even decades, growing into adulthood within this magical world. It's a gentle, almost wistful stretch of the film, a glimpse of who these children become once given the chance to grow into the responsibility that's been placed on them. And then, in a final twist that recontextualizes everything, the now adult siblings, while out hunting, stumble back through the very same wardrobe that brought them to Narnia in the first place, and tumble out the other side as children again, mere moments after they first disappeared, the entire decades-long reign compressed back into the span of a single afternoon in the real world. It's a melancholy, bittersweet note to end on, and the film, to its credit, doesn't rush past the strangeness of it. These children have lived entire adult lives, fought wars, ruled a kingdom, grown old together, and now find themselves abruptly small again, back in a quiet English country house, with no way to prove any of it happened, carrying the full emotional weight of an entire reign inside the bodies of children who haven't aged a single day. Let's spend some real time now on what's actually happening underneath all of this, because there's a remarkable amount of thematic and psychological depth buried inside what could have easily been just another studio fantasy spectacle. The film's true emotional center isn't really Aslan, despite how much narrative weight he carries. It's Edmund. His arc, jealousy curdling into betrayal, betrayal curdling into genuine suffering, suffering eventually giving way to humility and finally to real, demonstrated courage, is the most fully realized character journey in the entire film, and it's worth appreciating just how unflinching the film is willing to be about a child's capacity for real moral failure. Most family films are nervous about depicting children behaving genuinely badly, worried that audiences won't forgive a young protagonist for real wrongdoing. This film takes the opposite approach. It lets Edmund be genuinely, believably petty and selfish, lets his betrayal carry real consequences, lets other characters suffer because of his choices, including the imprisonment and near destruction of Mr. Tumnus, a kind, gentle creature whose only crime was showing Lucy mercy. And by refusing to soften Edmund's culpability, the film makes his eventual redemption mean something. Grace, in this story, isn't cheap. It costs Aslan everything. And Edmund's transformation isn't simply handed to him through a single apology scene. It's demonstrated, slowly, through accumulated action, culminating in that moment on the battlefield where he risks his own life to undo the damage his earlier choices set into motion. There's also something quietly resonant in how the film handles the broader experience of childhood displacement. These children didn't ask to be sent away from their mother. They didn't ask to be dropped into a strange house in the countryside. And they certainly didn't ask to be dropped into the middle of an ancient prophecy demanding they help liberate an entire kingdom. The film draws a clear, if unspoken, parallel between the real historical trauma of wartime evacuation and the fantastical trauma of being suddenly responsible for the fate of an entire magical world. Both experiences share the same core emotional texture: children forced to grow up faster than they should have to, asked to carry weight that feels too large for their shoulders, navigating it as best they can without a clear roadmap for how. Aslan's death and resurrection, of course, carries unmistakable theological resonance, given Lewis's own deeply held Christian faith and his explicit intentions in writing the original novel. But what's interesting about the film adaptation is how effectively that symbolism translates even for audiences who aren't engaging with it on a religious level at all. Strip away any specific theological reading, and what remains is still an enormously powerful, universally resonant idea, that an ancient, seemingly unbreakable law built on punishment and retribution can be overturned by an act of voluntary, undeserved sacrifice. That mercy, freely given, has the power to rewrite the rules that govern even the harshest, most entrenched systems of justice. You don't need any specific faith background to feel the emotional truth of that idea land. The White Witch herself deserves real credit as a villain, precisely because the film resists the temptation to make her simply, cartoonishly evil. Tilda Swinton plays her with an icy, regal composure that makes her menace feel earned rather than performed. Her cruelty isn't loud or theatrical. It's cold, patient, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency, a tyranny that's been so thoroughly normalized over 100 years of winter that most of Narnia's inhabitants have simply forgotten there was ever an alternative. That's a far more sophisticated, and frankly more unsettling, depiction of authoritarian power than most family fantasy films attempt. The idea that oppression doesn't always announce itself with screaming and violence. Sometimes it simply settles in as the new, accepted normal, until someone finally arrives willing to remind everyone that things weren't always this way, and don't have to stay this way either. Let's talk for a moment about the craftsmanship behind all of this, because the film's technical execution deserves genuine appreciation, particularly when measured against the visual effects standards of its era. Director Andrew Adamson and his production team made a deliberate, costly choice to prioritize practical filmmaking wherever possible, shooting on real locations in New Zealand that doubled beautifully for Narnia's varied landscapes, building real, tactile sets and costumes rather than relying entirely on green screen and digital environments. That choice pays off visibly throughout the film. The snow feels cold. The beaver's cozy little home feels lived in and warm. The texture of Narnia feels genuinely tactile in a way that elevates the fantasy beyond simple digital spectacle. The makeup and creature work, which earned the film its Academy Award, deserves particular praise, especially in how it brings characters like Mr. Tumnus and the various centaurs and fauns to life through a careful blend of practical prosthetics and digital enhancement, rather than rendering them as fully computer-generated creations from the ground up. There's a warmth, a believability to these creatures that comes specifically from that hybrid approach. The score, composed by Harry Gregson Williams, deserves real attention as well. Rather than leaning on generic, sweeping fantasy bombast, the score incorporates folk instrumentation and choral textures that give Narnia its own distinct musical identity, lending real emotional weight to the film's quieter, more contemplative moments, particularly during Aslan's death and the mournful sequence that follows it. If there are legitimate critiques to level against the film, they tend to cluster around its pacing in the back half. Once the battle sequence begins, some of the careful, patient character work that defines the film's first two acts gives way to fairly conventional large-scale fantasy combat, competently staged but lacking quite the same emotional specificity that made the earlier, quieter scenes so effective. Some critics at the time also noted that the film's reverence for its source material occasionally tips into a kind of cautious faithfulness, a hesitance to take any real creative risks that might have elevated certain sequences beyond simply, competently illustrating the novel rather than fully reimagining it for the screen. But these are relatively minor critiques against the backdrop of what the film achieves overall. Measured against other major fantasy adaptations of its era, it holds its own admirably, not quite reaching the operatic scale and ambition of The Lord of the Rings, but bringing a more intimate, character-driven emotional core that those larger, more sprawling epics sometimes sacrificed in favor of spectacle. So where does that leave us, at the end of this story? The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe succeeds because it understands something many family films forget, that children are capable of handling real weight, real moral complexity, real grief, as long as that weight is handled with care and eventually, earnestly, resolved with hope. It doesn't shy away from genuine consequence. It doesn't pretend that jealousy and betrayal are simple, easily forgiven mistakes. And it doesn't rush past genuine sorrow in its eagerness to reach a happy ending. What it offers instead is a story about four ordinary, frightened children, displaced by a very real war, who find themselves asked to carry an extraordinary weight in an extraordinary world, and who, through fear, failure, sacrifice, and eventual courage, prove themselves capable of carrying it. It's a story about how grace costs something, how forgiveness has to be earned through real sacrifice rather than simply granted for free, and how even the deepest, oldest, most entrenched winters eventually, inevitably, give way to spring. Final rating, 8 out of 10. A film that takes its young audience seriously, that trusts them to sit with real grief and real consequence, and that rewards that trust with one of the most quietly moving resurrections in modern family cinema. Not a flawless film, but a sincere one, and in a genre that often settles for spectacle over substance, that sincerity is exactly what makes it endure. If this breakdown gave you a deeper appreciation for the story hiding underneath the snow and the swords, let me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more worlds left to explore. But before we close this out, I want to go back and walk through a handful of moments again, more slowly this time, because there's texture in this film that genuinely rewards a second, closer look, and some of it gets lost if you only ever take in the broad strokes. Let's go back to the opening bombing raid one more time, because I don't think we gave it quite enough room earlier, and it deserves more. Notice the specific choice the film makes in how it stages that sequence. We don't open on grand, sweeping shots of London burning from a distance, the kind of cinematic wide shot that turns devastation into spectacle. We open close, tight, intimate, on the children's faces, on their mothers' hands gripping them, on the chaos of trying to gather coats and shoes and a single treasured photograph in the middle of complete panic. The camera stays low, stays grounded, refuses to let the horror of the Blitz become anything other than deeply personal and immediate. And there's a small, devastating detail tucked into this opening that's easy to miss on a first viewing. Edmund runs back into the house during the raid, risking his life, to retrieve a photograph of his father, who we come to understand is away fighting in the war himself. It's a tiny gesture, barely given any dialogue at all, but it tells you everything you need to know about what's actually driving Edmund underneath his prickliness. He's not simply a difficult, jealous child by nature. He's a boy whose father is absent, possibly in mortal danger, in a war that's already torn apart everything familiar in his life, and that absence is sitting underneath every single thing he does for the rest of the film, even when the story never explicitly draws attention to it again. That's worth carrying with you into every later scene involving Edmund. When he resists Peter's attempts to take charge, when he lashes out at his siblings, when he's so easily drawn in by the White Witch's promises of status and significance, all of it is happening in the shadow of a missing father, a boy quietly, desperately looking for some kind of authority figure to fill that gap, and finding, tragically, that the first person to offer him real attention and apparent validation is someone using that need against him. This is, I think, one of the most quietly sophisticated pieces of character writing in the entire film, and it's almost entirely visual. The film never sits Edmund down and has him explain his feelings about his absent father in a monologue. It simply shows you the wound early, in a single wordless gesture, and trusts you to carry that wound with you for the rest of the runtime, recognizing its fingerprints on every subsequent choice he makes. Let's also spend more time with the professor's house itself, because the setting does more emotional work than it initially appears to. That house is enormous, and the film makes a point of emphasizing just how echoing, how cavernous, how full of empty, unused space it actually is. There's a sequence early on where the children are simply wandering its hallways, peering into rooms draped in dust sheets, finding furniture that's clearly gone untouched for years. This isn't just incidental world building. It's establishing a mirror for the children's own emotional state. They've been pulled out of a small, familiar, lived-in home and dropped into a place that's grand but hollow, impressive but empty, full of rooms that no one seems to actually use or care for. And that emptiness becomes the exact condition that makes the wardrobe's discovery possible. If this house were full, busy, occupied by a large family with constant activity, there would be no quiet, forgotten upstairs room for Lucy to wander into during a rainy afternoon. The loneliness of the setting is what creates the opportunity for wonder. There's something quietly true in that, the idea that magic, real or metaphorical, often finds the cracks in our lives specifically where boredom and loneliness have left an opening. Lucy isn't looking for Narnia. She's looking for somewhere to hide during a game of hide and seek, in a house so large and underused that an entire hidden world can apparently exist in one of its spare rooms without anyone noticing for years. The rain matters too. The film keeps returning to shots of water streaking down windows, gray skies pressing down on the estate, a persistent dampness that mirrors the children's own emotional state of suspended, directionless grief. They're not allowed to properly mourn the disruption of their lives, not in any dramatic way, because nothing catastrophic has technically happened to them yet. They've simply been removed from everything familiar and placed somewhere unfamiliar, asked to wait out a war they have no control over, in a house that isn't theirs, with a guardian who, however kind, isn't their parent. That low-grade, persistent ache of displacement, without any single dramatic event to point to as its cause, is an enormously relatable feeling, and the film captures it with real patience before ever introducing a single piece of magic. Let's go deeper on Mr. Tumnus as well, because there's more happening in that first encounter with Lucy than simple whimsy. Watch his behavior carefully when Lucy first appears in the snowy wood. He's startled, yes, but his fear isn't simply the fear of meeting a strange creature. It's specifically the fear of being seen, of being caught in the act of encountering a human child, which suggests, even before any explanation is given, that he already understands the danger this meeting puts him in. His nervousness throughout their entire tea scene together isn't just charming social awkwardness. It's the visible, mounting tension of someone trying to enjoy an innocent moment of connection while knowing, the entire time, that he's supposed to be betraying the very person he's sharing that moment with. That tension is what makes his eventual confession so affecting. When he finally breaks down and admits he's been planning to turn Lucy over to the White Witch's secret police, it doesn't feel like a plot twist sprung on the audience. It feels like the inevitable release of pressure that's been quietly building throughout the entire scene, visible in every nervous glance, every too quick change of subject, every flash of guilt crossing his face whenever Lucy says something especially kind or trusting. And here's what I think is the most important detail in the entire sequence. Tumnus doesn't decide to help Lucy escape because he calculates that it's the safer choice. He does it specifically because she trusted him, because she was kind to him, because the simple, uncomplicated warmth of their afternoon together made betraying her feel unbearable, regardless of the personal cost. That's an enormous moral statement to embed inside what looks, on the surface, like a cozy little tea scene between a child and a fawn. Decency, the film is quietly arguing, isn't really about calculating risk and reward. It's about being unable to betray someone who has shown you genuine kindness, even when every rational incentive points towards self-preservation instead. That's exactly the choice that gets Tumnus turned to stone. And it's worth sitting with the unfairness of that consequence for a moment, because the film doesn't pretend it isn't unfair. Tumnus does the right thing, the genuinely brave and decent thing, and he suffers enormously for it. There's no convenient escape, no last-minute rescue sparing him from punishment. He pays the full price for his decency, and the film makes us carry that injustice with us for the rest of the story, right up until his eventual restoration after Aslan's resurrection. That's a far more honest depiction of moral courage than most family films attempt. Doing the right thing doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it simply costs you everything, and you do it anyway, because the alternative, betraying someone who trusted you, would cost you something even more important. Let's also revisit the scene where Lucy returns from her first trip to Narnia and isn't believed, because there's more emotional complexity there than a simple nobody believes the youngest sibling trope. Notice how each sibling reacts differently, because their reactions tell you something distinct about each of their characters before the plot has really given them room to demonstrate it otherwise. Susan's skepticism comes from a place of practical concern, an older sister instinct to manage and contain what looks, to her, like an overactive imagination that might cause problems if left unchecked. She's not cruel about it. She's simply trying to keep order in a household that already feels precarious and unstable. Peter's skepticism is gentler, almost indulgent, the kind of dismissal that comes from someone who's trying to hold the family together and doesn't have room, in his own mind, to entertain anything that might complicate that responsibility further. He's already carrying so much weight, trying to be the responsible eldest sibling in a strange house during a terrifying war, that Lucy's claims about a magical wardrobe simply don't have anywhere to land. He's not unkind to her. He's just overloaded. Edmund's response is the only genuinely cruel one, and that cruelty is specific and pointed in a way the other sibling's skepticism isn't. He doesn't simply doubt her. He mocks her, deliberately, in front of the others, turning her vulnerability into a moment of public humiliation. That's worth noting as an early, clear signal of where Edmund's character is at before the witch ever enters the picture. He's already someone willing to use someone else's pain as a tool for his own momentary status, even within his own family, even against his youngest sibling who has done nothing to deserve it. The White Witch doesn't create this impulse in him. She simply finds it already there, waiting, and offers him a much larger stage to exercise it on. Now let's spend real time on the witch's first meeting with Edmund, because the seduction happening in that scene is more carefully constructed than it might initially appear. She doesn't lead with power. She leads with curiosity and warmth, asking him gentle, probing questions about his life, his family, his siblings, listening, or appearing to listen, with a focus that nobody else in his life seems to be giving him at that exact moment. This is a deliberate manipulation tactic, and the film stages it almost exactly the way real grooming and manipulation tends to work in the real world, identifying a specific emotional vulnerability and then meeting it, generously, before ever asking for anything in return. The Turkish delight itself is worth lingering on for a moment too, because it's doing more than simply functioning as enchanted candy. It's bottomless. No matter how much Edmund eats, there's always more, and the film frames this excess almost as a kind of quiet horror rather than simple indulgence.